What would you do if you were the last Roman soldier in history? Not a legionary from a film, but the last defender of a 1,000-year-old wall, watching as an army so vast it looks like an ocean of steel prepares to wipe your world from the map. Feel the stone tremble beneath your feet each time the world's largest cannon fires. It is a sound that does not belong to this world, an artificial thunder heralding the apocalypse. Smell the acrid mix of gunpowder, incense, and fear rising from the city. In the great church of Hagia Sophia, the chants of the final mass struggle to rise above the deafening roar of Ottoman war drums. Observe the horizon. To the sea, you see no water, only a forest of masts from hundreds of enemy ships. To the land, you see no fields, only the tents of more than 100,000 soldiers who have come to devour your home. Listen to your commander's cry, a blend of desperation and defiance, as he orders the breach in the wall repaired one more time, knowing the next shot is only hours away. This is not an epic fiction. This was the desperate vigil of the last defenders of Constantinople on the night of May 28, 1453. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a battle. It is the chronicle of the day the Middle Ages were demolished by cannon fire. It is the tale of how the fall of one city forced humanity to discover a new world. To understand the end, you must know the contenders. It was an inevitable clash between a glorious past that refused to die and a relentless future demanding to be born. On one side, the Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, but it was now merely a shadow of its former glory. Its heart, Constantinople, the queen of cities, which once housed nearly 1 million souls, was now a ghost. Fewer than 50,000 people lived within its colossal walls, a Christian enclave surrounded by a Turkish ocean that had devoured everything else. Its leader was Emperor Constantine X, Palaiologos, a tragic man, an emperor without an empire, heir to a 1,000-year-old title who now ruled over little more than his capital. On the other side, the Ottoman Empire, the rising superpower, young, vibrant, and boundless in its ambition. Its leader was Sultan Mehmed II. He was only 21, but he possessed the mind of a genius and the will of a conqueror. He was no barbarian. He was a Renaissance prince, fluent in multiple languages, a student of Roman engineering, and driven by an unshakable sense of prophetic destiny. He was obsessed with taking the city. Meanwhile, Christian Europe watched from a distance, paralyzed by its own rivalries. Genoa and Venice, the merchant republics, sent limited aid, more to protect their commercial interests than out of faith. The Pope tried and failed to unite the Catholic kingdoms to save their Orthodox brothers. But the old wounds of the religious schism ran too deep. Constantinople was alone, tragically, magnificently alone before the storm. The siege of Constantinople was, above all, the baptism by fire of a new age of warfare, an age where gunpowder artillery would render the greatest medieval fortifications obsolete. Imagine the morning of April 1453. The defenders on the walls watched the horizon darken. It is not a cloud. It is the Ottoman army. The sound of hundreds of thousands of men, horses, and camels is like the roar of the earth itself. The city, the great Constantinople, is completely blockaded, by land and by sea, a strangulation of steel and wood. The psychological impact is devastating. Inside the walls, there are fewer than 7,000 soldiers. Outside, an overwhelming force outnumbers them more than 10 to 1. But the true protagonist of this story is not of flesh and blood. It is of bronze. It is the Great Turkish Bombard, nicknamed Basilica, built for Mehmed by a renegade Hungarian engineer named Orban. Its dimensions are monstrous, 8 meters long, capable of firing 600-kilogram stone projectiles over a kilometer. Each shot was an event. The slow, hours-long loading process, the deafening blast that made ears bleed, and then the impact. An earthquake that shook the legendary Theodosian walls, the triple line of defense that had withstood every siege for over 1,000 years. The sound of the cannon became the soundtrack to the city's final days. The terror was constant. Nights were not for sleeping, but for a frantic race against time. Men, women, and children by torchlight repaired the breaches in the walls with earth-filled barrels, with wooden beams with the stones of their own churches. A desperate struggle against the dawn, which always brought the next bombardment. Amidst the chaos and gunpowder, the city's defense was upheld by two men, two leaders who embodied the soul of the resistance. On one hand, Constantine V, the last Caesar, a man conscious of the weight of history on his shoulders. Mehmed offered him safe passage, lordship in Greece, a life of luxury. Constantine refused. He could not abandon his people. He could not be the emperor who surrendered the city of Constantine the Great. He chose to die with his empire. On the other, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese mercenary, a soldier of fortune. But in Constantinople, he became something more. He was the foremost siege expert of his time, and his arrival with 700 men was a ray of hope. He became the heart and mind of the defense, his energy and tactical genius inspiring Greeks and Latins to forget their differences and fight as brothers. The emperor's reliance on his general was absolute. He was the human core of an impossible defense. But beyond their heroism, what they faced was the future. Orban's cannon was not just a weapon. It was a turning point in history. Its firepower proved that no stone wall, no matter how high or thick, could withstand the power of gunpowder. The medieval castle, the symbol of feudal power, became obsolete. The knight in his armor, useless against a cannonball. Power no longer resided with feudal lords, but with kings and sultans who could fund professional armies and cannon foundries. The siege of Constantinople was the most brutal and bloody demonstration of this new world. The city's defense, despite its overwhelming numerical inferiority, was a masterpiece of courage, ingenuity, and sheer desperation. It held the most powerful army in the world at bay for 53 days. Life inside. The besieged city became a routine of prayer and deprivation. Food was rationed. The sound of church bells calling to prayer was constant, a plea to a heaven that seemed not to be listening. In a final miracle of unity, Catholics and Orthodox held Mass together, healing a centuries-old wound on the threshold of death. Hope was a dwindling resource. Every day, lookouts scanned the sea, hoping to see the sails of a Venetian rescue fleet, a fleet that would never arrive. The defenders did not merely wait. They unleashed the Empire's secret superweapon, one of the most terrifying substances of medieval warfare, Greek fire, a chemical compound that could be launched from siphons that burned on water and clung to the hulls of ships. Several Ottoman vessels were consumed by this liquid hell, an echo of Rome's ancient power. But Mehmed responded with a stroke of genius that left the defenders stunned. Frustrated at his inability to break the giant chain protecting the Golden Horn harbor, he did the unthinkable. He ordered his men to build a road of greased logs over a hill, and in a single night they dragged 70 of his ships overland from the Bosphorus into the inner harbor. The defenders awoke to see an Ottoman fleet where the day before there was nothing. A new front had been opened. The noose around the city's neck had tightened. Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon, wrote in his diary of the men's total exhaustion, fighting day and night, their morale swinging violently between hope after each repelled assault and utter despair at the enemy's scale. Finally, the last night of Rome arrived, May 28, 1453. The final assault was an operation of overwhelming force, designed not just to break the walls, but to annihilate the defenders' spirit. Imagine the atmosphere in those final hours. A heavy silence fell over the Ottoman camp, a calm heralding the storm. Inside the walls, Constantine V gathered his commanders for his final address, not as an emperor, to his subjects, but as a father bidding farewell to his children, asking them to die for their faith and their home. Then, the entire city, Greeks and Latins, nobles and commoners, gathered in the great basilica of Hagia Sophia. They celebrated the last Christian Mass in its 1,000-year history. It was a moment of sublime unity, of resignation, and of peace before the end. At 1:30 in the morning, hell was unleashed. The silence was shattered by the thunder of thousands of drums and trumpets, followed by the war cry of tens of thousands of men charging into the attack. Allahu Akbar! Mehmed launched his assault in 3 waves. The first, the irregular troops, the Bashi Bazouks. They were cannon fodder sent to exhaust the defenders and absorb the first casualties. They fought for 2 hours and were repelled. The second wave, the regular Anatolian troops, better equipped and disciplined. They attacked the weakened walls, but the defense, led by Giustiniani, held firm. They 2 were driven back. Finally, as dawn began to break and the defenders were on the verge of collapse, Mehmed played his trump card, his elite bodyguards, the Janissaries, the finest soldiers in the world. They attacked with terrifying discipline and ferocity. At that critical moment, tragedy struck. A cannonball mortally wounded Giustiniani. The general, the hero of the defense, asked to be carried from the wall. Seeing him leave, panic spread among his men. Morale shattered. Almost at the same instant, fate sealed the city's doom. A small group of Ottomans discovered a postern, a small gate called the Kirka Porta, that had been mistakenly left unbarred. They slipped inside, climbed a tower, and planted the Ottoman standard. When the defenders saw the enemy flag flying within their own walls, the resistance collapsed. Emperor Constantine, seeing that all was lost, tore off his imperial insignia. He cried out, "Is there no Christian here to take my head?" and charged into the fray, dying as an anonymous soldier. His body was never identified with certainty. The last Caesar had fallen, but as one empire died, another was born. We must shift perspective and look through the eyes of the conqueror. For the young Sultan Mehmed, this was not a night of destruction, but of creation. Imagine his anxiety in his tent, listening to battle reports. His frustration as the first 2 waves were repulsed by that incredibly tenacious resistance. And then, his final exultation upon receiving the news that his standards were flying over the walls. For him, this was not the end. It was the greatest of beginnings. The realization of an Ottoman dream spanning generations. The fulfillment of a prophecy attributed to the Prophet Muhammad about the city's conquest. As he entered Constantinople, he did not see himself as a destroyer. He saw himself as the new Caesar, the heir by right of conquest to the Roman Empire. The contrast is absolute. For the Christians, it was the apocalypse. For Mehmed, it was the dawn of a new golden age. After the fall, and following the military tradition of the time, the greatest city in Christendom was subjected to 3 days of brutal sack. It was a descent into chaos and horror. Ottoman soldiers, thirsty for booty, were unleashed upon the streets. The air filled with screams. Thousands of desperate civilians ran to Hagia Sophia, the great church, seeking refuge. They believed in an old prophecy that said when the enemy reached the column of Constantine, an angel would descend from heaven with a sword and save them. But the angel never came. The basilica's bronze doors were battered down. The terrified congregation was massacred or chained. The sack of Constantinople was one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in history. Entire libraries, containing irreplaceable manuscripts from ancient Greece and Rome, were burned or sold for pennies. Holy relics, accumulated over 1,000 years, were desecrated or melted down for their gold and silver. The fate of the population was terrible. Tens of thousands were enslaved. Entire families were torn apart forever in the empire's slave markets. Inside Hagia Sophia, the most sacred site of Orthodox Christianity, 1,000 years of liturgy came to an end. The world that had known Constantinople as its beacon was no more. The shockwave from the city's fall shook the foundations of Europe. It was not just the loss of a distant city. It was an event that accelerated the rise of the modern world in 2 fundamental ways. Imagine being a merchant in Venice or Genoa upon receiving the news. It is panic. The Silk Road, the main commercial artery to the riches of the East, was now under the total control of a single, powerful Muslim power. Mehmed could charge whatever taxes he wished, or simply close the route at his whim. Europe's economic model was broken. This crisis led to 2 monumental consequences. First, the Renaissance. Byzantine scholars, artists, and philosophers fled the fallen city for Italy. They did not arrive empty-handed. They brought with them a treasure trove of knowledge, Greek manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, texts that had been lost to the West during the Middle Ages. This influx of classical learning was a crucial catalyst that fanned the flames of the Italian Renaissance. Second, the Age of Discovery. With the land route to Asia's spices and silk blocked or controlled by a rival, Atlantic nations like Portugal and Spain were forced to find an alternative. They had to find a sea route. This desperate need led directly to the voyages of Vasco da Gama around Africa, and, crucially, to the obsession of a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus to find a path to the West. The map of the world was redrawn by the fall of a single city. Europe's economic and political center of gravity shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The medieval world, with its axis in Rome and Constantinople, was dead. A new world, with new continents, new trade routes, and new ideas, was born from the ashes of the Queen of Cities. Imagine for a moment Mehmed II, the conqueror, riding his horse into the majestic Hagia Sophia, marveling at its grandeur before declaring it a mosque. Now, imagine a nameless Byzantine scholar, disembarking in Florence, clutching a manuscript of Plato he managed to save from the flames, a text that will change Western thought. And finally, picture a young Genoese navigator named Columbus, hearing stories in the ports of the blocked route and feeling the conviction grow within him that there must be another way. The death of one city gave birth to the destiny of them all. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was more than the end of the Roman Empire. It was the collapse of a certainty. It was the event that forced an insular Europe to look beyond its horizons, to rediscover its classical past, and to launch itself toward an unknown future on the oceans. It was the violent, tragic proof that sometimes one world must die so that a new one can be born. Considering its impact on the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery, do you believe the fall of Constantinople was the most important event that marked the end of the Middle Ages? Or were other factors more decisive? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this journey through the day that demolished a world has moved you, subscribe. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.